and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be presenting about misinformation and disinformation. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides and we'll get started. So for today, I'm going to start off by defining disinformation and misinformation using a case study. Then we'll discuss some offline impact of disinformation, followed by some reasons as to why bad information is difficult to contain. I'll provide a little bit of data regarding the pre and post sentiment for the 2020 election. Then I'll give you some thoughts on why social media users spread misinformation. And to close today, I'll give you some tips to consider when you're using social media. So first, I define disinformation as false information that is intentionally manufactured to appear credible, deceive and confuse, and distort facts. So let's take a look at an example that I developed. This is a piece of disinformation that came out in 2016. So if you look at this, it looks very credible and persuasive. Let's break down some of the reasons why that's the case. First, if you look at the top left-hand corner of this image, you'll see that it's allegedly from a trusted news outlet, NBC. But what's most striking about this piece is this image here of Bill Murray that's professional, and you would expect somewhere like NBC to hire a professional graphic designer to come up with this. Now, the tagline for this says, "I am running for president in 2016. So it's as if Bill Murray himself has endorsed this article. Finally, down here at the bottom, we see that there's an author associated with this piece, and it's been tagged as news. So though disinformation can be very persuasive and difficult to spot, you can look for some red flags. So in this case, this appears to be from a credible source. However, if you were to go and look at, say, ABC News, Fox News, or any other news outlet, you would see that this information is unverifiable. Nobody else would be covering the story. Typically, with these types of articles, they usually come out from an unknown author. In this case, it's not a staff byline, so you can easily Google this person's name to see if it's a familiar journalist with an extensive background and career. Finally, in most cases, and unless you're a huge Bill Murray fan, it won't be the case with this one, but pieces of disinformation are going to elicit strong emotions, and it's usually fear or outrage. So let's look at the definition of misinformation. This is false information that is shared with no motive or deliberate attempt to mislead others. People will share it because it aligns with their own attitudes, beliefs, and political leanings. So if we return back to this example with Bill Murray, almost immediately we saw all over social media that people were taking this article, coming up with their own hashtags. So we can see here, hashtag I'm with Bill Murray. But let's take a look at this second tweet here. We're seeing that yes, he's running for president. Take a look at this link. Just to reiterate some of the points that Cliff brought up in his presentation, you want to be very careful with the things that you're clicking online. It appears as if this is coming from a trusted news outlet, ABC, but this CO here is an indication that this is in fact not from an ABC News domain. So be very careful with what you click. So misinformation is something that researchers have been studying significantly over the last few years. And this was an interesting case. They found that on average, a false story reaches 1,500 people 6 times faster than a factual story. And in the case of politics, it's more likely to go viral. So if we think about this example once more, what happened once this article was debunked? And it was debunked very quickly. Bill Murray and his publicist came out and said, no, he's not running for president. Well, misinformation and disinformation doesn't just disappear from the internet. It continues to circulate and come up later. So 6 months later, we're seeing on Facebook, here this person is posting, if this is real, he's got my vote, and a new hashtag associated with it, Murray 2016. So if you are ever in doubt of the legitimacy of an article, don't share it. Wait, look up further information on it to see whether it's factual or not. When misinformation is old news, make sure you go back on your accounts and delete it, Because as we saw with this example, it does recirculate and resurface over time. So let's switch gears and talk about offline impact of disinformation. This is a real example that happened in April 2013. At the time, the Boston Marathon bombings had just happened, and about a week and a half later, the Associated Press's Twitter account was hacked. This tweet appeared on their feed and went out to about 2 million followers. It says, breaking, 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama is injured. So very quickly, an Associated Press employee came forward and denied this rumor. But researchers looked at what happened after that case. And so this is a data visualization 2 seconds afterwards. What you're seeing here are Twitter accounts, and the ones in red are spreading this rumor. If you look closely, you'll see these blue dots. These are Twitter users who are questioning the legitimacy of this rumor. And finally, even more difficult to see, you have these yellow accounts, which are people who are correcting the rumor. So what this really shows us is that once a rumor and misinformation is out there, it's difficult to contain and correct. So very quickly, this case was identified as being a hack, and it was corrected. So what happened outside of Twitter? Outside of Twitter, the stock market, the S&P 500 dropped in value to the tune of $136.5 billion in value from a single tweet. And we're talking about 2013. So this example really just shows how connected different systems are to social media. So what's changed? We have access to technology, but I think it's important to remember that people have always been hungry for information. So what you're looking at here is the New York subways in the 1940s. Everyone has a newspaper in hand. And in 2015, we're seeing that people now have devices. And what's changed is that we now have access to information at the speed and connectivity like we never had before. However, this unrestricted access is not always accurate. So you really need to be careful with what you're accessing and using. So briefly, let's talk about why bad information is difficult to contain. I have a few reasons for you to consider. So first, the volume of content creation is absolutely substantial, and it gets faster and more content goes out every single day. So in looking at Facebook, 6,000 tweets, or looking at Twitter, 6,000 tweets are sent every second. And with Facebook, they host 300 million new photos every day. So with that amount of information coming out, it's difficult to parse through it to see what's correct and what's disinformation. Not only that, these systems are designed to increase time on site. Engagement ranking systems on social media favor these posts that elicit the strongest emotional response possible. And finally, there have been poor attempts to mitigate the issues. So platforms are aware of these issues, especially given the conversations in climate over the last few years, but they've had very little incentives to correct the problems. Further oversight, which we're expecting to see, will likely change things. So in 2021, about half of Americans get their news via social media. And just take a look here at some of the research that Pew Research found. They said that these are the percentage of people who are regularly getting their news from these different platforms. So in pre-2016, Americans were very concerned about made-up news. 82% of Americans were either somewhat or very concerned about the potential impact of made-up news on the election. And when I saw this information, I wanted to know more about these Americans, who they were. Interestingly enough, they found that the percentage of concern was almost identical between both parties. After the elections, we're seeing that 60% of Americans believe that misinformation had a major impact on the outcome of the election. Though we know that this wasn't the case, this is still very concerning. And we've heard a lot from Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen recently. And one comment from her testimony that I found to be incredibly powerful was that Facebook weakens democracy. So this is really important to consider. And I'm going to have to agree with her on that one. So very briefly, let's now go through some of the reasons why misinformation spreads. We could be here all afternoon to discuss this, but I'm going to focus on three key concepts: echo chambers, confirmation bias, and fake narratives. For echo chambers, there's been significant amount of research in this area. In 2018, researchers looked at 2.7 billion tweets that were sent between 2009 and 2016. What they found was that partisan users are both consuming and producing content with a one-sided leaning. Now that's to be expected. However, the findings from this study that were most significant and interesting were that content produced by bipartisan users receives less attention. Now, more recently, researchers looked at 100 million pieces of content from 4 different social media platforms. They looked at controversial topics, and what they found was that users prefer information adhering to their worldviews, ignore dissenting information, and form polarized groups around shared narratives. So when polarization is high, misinformation quickly proliferates. So this is a data visualization on 2 hashtags in 2016. I'm with her and Make America Great Again. What you're seeing here are Twitter accounts. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are blue dots in both of these echo chambers. Those are accounts that researchers have identified as being people having human-like characteristics when they tweet. Now, these red dots here are accounts that have been flagged for bot-like characteristics. And what you're seeing here are these echo chambers, and people are actively engaging bots. So be very careful with the accounts that you are engaging on social media, because they could have nefarious purposes behind them. They could be part of a disinformation campaign. So when it comes to echo chambers, just keep this in mind. I think this encompasses it well. We really want to be seeing, hearing, and speaking that we're right. For confirmation bias, this is a tendency to believe information that aligns with our personal beliefs and worldviews. And I posted about this recently, saying that if your main access to news and current events is via social media shares and retweets, recognize that you're receiving information through the lens of someone else. It's what the sharer deems as important, not you. So this is how we create and reinforce echo chambers on social media. So what can you do about this? You should be going to trusted news outlets for your news and not just using social media. And also, when you do your own research on different topics, make sure you review more than one source. So here we have a great example of this. This person says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides, time to do my own research on the real truth and issues. So this person goes to a search engine, types in that hotly debated topic, and boom, literally the first link that agrees with what he already believes, his research is over. So make sure that you're checking more sources when you're doing this type of research. Briefly, let's discuss fake narratives, images, and videos. We see these all the time in the form of memes, and photos, and videos. And one particular case that was interesting came out in 2017. This was dubbed #Koigate. So what you're seeing here is an image from former President Trump's visit to Japan. This image shows him emptying a box of fish food into a koi pond, and this was spread all over social media and even news outlets. And basically people were saying that he did not represent the United States well abroad. But if we take a closer look at this incident, we can see that even with 2 photos, they tell 2 very different stories associated with them. And if we go even closer to get the full context with video, then we see for ourselves what actually happened here. So as you can see, they are both feeding the fish at the koi pond. Prime Minister Abe, who also happens to be a USC alum, he's now done feeding the fish. So he takes this box, he throws all the fish food in, and President Trump follows. And this is the image that's taken, and we saw all over social media. So as you can see, very different story, the more information we get and the more context we get from it. So when it comes to viral political videos and posts, before you share these, ask questions and find out who, what, where, when, why, and how. And for breaking news, especially as it relates to political figures and election results, wait until information has been vetted and verified before you share it. First Draft has come up with an amazing concept that I think is important to share for you today. And they say, think sheep on social media. So look at the source. Is it reliable? Look at the history. Is there an agenda? How long has this account been active? Do they have a specific political leaning with them? Find out what evidence is available. Is there information to support the claims? And make sure it's independent, verifiable information. Emotion, are they relying on emotion to make their point? Are you finding yourself fearful or having outrage? And in terms of pictures, as we just saw with the Coygate example, are they being used to garner more attention? So what's next with this information? It's becoming much more strategic and persuasive than ever before. We're seeing that with these newer platforms where there's less regulation and content moderation. There have been strategies to spread content on more of the commonly used platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Disinformation is being used in this cross-platform strategy, and that's because it's less likely to be removed. And hopefully in the future, we will see some Section 230 reform. The big question is, should social media companies be held accountable for content that platforms are hosting? And it really depends on what they're classified and if they become classified as a publisher. So what can you do as a user when you see misinformation and disinformation on social media? First, don't share it. Disengage from any of these communities that share misinformation. And when available, report content using the features that are available. Report the content directly to a campaign because they will want to know what's being said about their candidate. And finally, submit a tip to the FBI. They will also want to know if there's a threat. So to summarize today's presentation, misinformation and disinformation have real offline impact. Fake posts are persuasive and they play off our emotions. And if you are sharing unverified information, know that you could be contributing to the spread of misinformation. Thank you so much for your attention.